The sun had started to set over the neighborhood in Detroit, casting long shadows on the quiet, cracked streets. Clint Eastwood's character, Walt Kowalski, sat on his front porch, the old, familiar surroundings of his home, holding memories of a life long lived. The Gran Torino, his prized 1972 Ford, sat gleaming in the driveway, a symbol of his stubborn pride and unyielding determination. It wasn't just a car to him. It was the last thing he had left from his past, his own piece of the American dream. But tonight, something in the air felt different. The peace of the neighborhood had been shattered for weeks, ever since the gang had started making their presence felt in the community. Walt, a Korean War veteran, had seen it all, life, death, and everything in between. But even a man as hardened as Walt could feel the tension hanging heavy in the air. His eyes narrowed as he watched the young gang members lurking around the block. They had been terrorizing his neighborhood, causing fear and unrest. Walt's contempt for them was clear, not just for the way they lived, but for how they disrespected everything he held dear. The previous night, things had escalated. The gang, led by a ruthless young man named Thau's cousin, had crossed a line, breaking into his garage, trying to steal his prized Gran Torino. They were testing him. Walt knew this wouldn't end without bloodshed. He was prepared for what was to come. Walt's only companion now was his dog, Daisy. As she sat by his side, he stroked her fur absently, contemplating the choices that lay ahead. He had done everything he could to avoid confrontation, but it was clear this was no longer about survival. This was about redemption. It was about protecting what was left of the life he once knew. Tonight, Walt would stand alone, but he would stand tall. This was no longer just a fight for his car, for his neighborhood, or for himself. This was about taking a stand against the gang's reign of terror, a final stand that would cost him everything, but in the end, he would find peace. The wind picked up slightly as Walt stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure if it was from age or the weight of what was to come, but there was a look in his eyes, a fierce determination. He went inside, preparing himself for the night ahead. Little did he know, this would be the last time he ever stepped foot in his house. And with that, the storm was coming. The darkness had fully settled over the neighborhood by the time Walt stepped out of his house, the Gran Torino gleaming beneath the dim streetlights. His hands were steady now, but his heart raced with the knowledge that this night would end in violence. He knew what he had to do, and despite the inevitable danger, he didn't hesitate. Walt had lived through worse, faced enemies far fiercer than the gang outside his front door. But none of that made the coming fight any less daunting. As he walked down the front steps, his boots crunching on the gravel, Walt heard the sound of voices growing louder from across the street. The gang was gathering. He could see their figures illuminated by the occasional flash of a passing car's headlights, menacing, confident, like wolves about to close in on their prey. Thau, the young boy he had mentored, had tried to warn him, but Walt knew the gang wouldn't be satisfied until they'd broken him, broken everyone. Walt reached the end of his driveway, and his eyes locked onto the group. At the center was the gang leader, a tall, imposing figure with a sneer on his face, surrounded by his followers. They were laughing, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Walt had always been a man of few words, but tonight, his silence spoke volumes. One of the gang members, a lanky young man who had harassed Thau earlier, noticed Walt first. His eyes widened in disbelief, and then he sneered. Well, well, If it isn't the old man with the shiny car. You think you can stop us, old man? You're out of your league." Walt didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. He wasn't going to back down. Not tonight. He spoke, his voice gruff and deliberate. "This is my neighborhood, and I'll be damned if I let you ruin it. You've been terrorizing these people long enough." The gang leader laughed. It was a low, mocking laugh, one that made Walt's blood boil. You're just an old man. What are you going to do, call the cops? You can't stop us, Grandpa. You're nothing." Walt didn't respond. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a revolver, the cold metal glinting in the streetlight. The gang members froze, their laughter fading into nervous tension. Walt's hand was steady, his grip firm as he held the gun at his side. "Make no mistake," Walt said quietly. "I'm not afraid of you, but you should be afraid of me." The gang leader's confidence wavered for just a moment, but he quickly regained it. "You think you scare me, old man? You're gonna die alone." Walt's gaze never wavered as he took another step forward, the revolver now aimed directly at the gang leader's chest. That's the thing about life. You never know when it's going to end, but you'll find out tonight. You'll all find out tonight. The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then the gang leader motioned for his men to take action. It was the moment Walt had been waiting for, the calm before the storm was over. The first move came suddenly, with one of the gang members rushing toward Walt, his hand outstretched, reaching for a knife. Walt's eyes were sharp, and in an instant, his finger tightened on the revolver's trigger. The shot rang out, loud and deafening in the stillness of the night. The young man dropped to the ground with a thud, a bloodied mess by the curb. The gang froze for a split second, stunned by the sheer brutality of the moment. Walt didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes locked onto the gang leaders, unshaken, unwavering. For a brief moment, he could hear his heart beating in his chest, steady and strong, as if reminding him that he was still alive. But there was no going back now. The remaining gang members were on edge, their hands twitching near their weapons, unsure of how to proceed. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance. Walt wasn't just an old man. He was a man who had lived through wars, who had seen more death than they could possibly comprehend. "You should have stayed out of this, old man," the gang leader sneered, trying to muster some courage. He nodded to one of his men, a heavy-set thug with a tattoo on his neck, who drew a gun and aimed it directly at Walt. Walt didn't move. His fingers curled around the revolver, the weight of it steady in his hand. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet rage, a lifetime of resentment and regret focused into this singular moment. The thug fired. The bullet whizzed by Walt's ear, missing him by inches. He didn't waste a second. In one swift motion, he drew the revolver again and fired. The thug went down, crumpling to the ground with a grunt. Walt's face remained stoic, but inside his mind was clear. He knew this wasn't going to end without sacrifice. His life was on the line, but the stakes were higher than just his own survival. The gang leader yelled for everyone to move, to take Walt down at all costs. It was chaos now. Two more of his men surged forward, hoping to overpower him. Walt moved with a precision that came from years of experience. He fired again. One of the men went down instantly, clutching his chest. The other lunged, a blade flashing in his hand. Walt's body moved almost instinctively as he sidestepped the knife, a surge of adrenaline flooding his senses. The man stumbled past him off balance, and before he could recover, Walt turned, swinging the revolver with expert precision. The shot was clean. Another body fell, but there were still more. The gang wasn't giving up, and they were desperate. The leader was the last one left standing, his face twisted with rage and fear. Walt could see the hesitation in his eyes. The gang had lost most of their men, and now it was just down to him. Walt took a step forward, slowly, never breaking eye contact. His voice was calm, almost detached. "You should have listened. You came into my world, and now you're going to learn what happens when you don't respect it." The gang leader raised his weapon, his hand shaking slightly. Walt could see the fear creeping in now, the fear of death, but the leader wasn't going down without a fight. He pulled the trigger. The bullet missed, grazing Walt's shoulder. He didn't flinch. Walt's finger was already on the trigger again. In the same moment, the revolver spoke. A single shot rang out, and the gang leader collapsed, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Walt stood over him, breathing heavily, his body bruised and bloodied, but still standing. He looked down at the man, his eyes cold. The battle was over, but the price had been paid. The sound of silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Walt's breathing was ragged, the weight of what he'd just done pressing heavily on his chest. His hand, still gripped around the revolver, was slick with sweat and blood. The weight of the gun, a reminder of the final moments of violence he had just survived. But his work wasn't done yet. Walt turned, his gaze falling on the bodies of the men he had just killed. They lay scattered on the ground, their lives snuffed out in an instant by the old man who had spent so many years in quiet retirement. His body ached, the pain of his old age beginning to take hold. But there was a strange clarity in his mind, a quiet peace that only those who had faced death and walked away could understand. This was the end of something, but also the beginning of something else. As he stood over the bodies, Walt heard the faintest sound from behind him. He turned slowly, knowing instinctively who it was. Thao, the young boy he had tried to mentor, was standing at the end of the driveway, his face pale with shock. His hands were trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief. Walt could see the boy's confusion, his horror. Thao had witnessed the violence unfold before him, and now he was left standing at the crossroads, unsure of what to make of the man who had just killed. The boy had grown up in the same world as these gang members, had seen the violence that had defined his life. But he hadn't seen it from this side, the side where a man like Walt, someone who had long since stopped caring about his own survival, took matters into his own hands. Walt's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he spoke to the boy. "You don't owe them anything, Thao. This is the world they made, not the one you have to live in. It's time to make a choice." Thao's eyes were filled with a mix of fear and admiration. He had never expected Walt, the gruff, stubborn old man, to stand up like this, to become the very thing the gang feared. But there was no turning back now. The violence that had been sown in the neighborhood was over, but the cost was high. Thao was left with a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. I don't know what to say," Thao stammered, still processing the events. Walt gave him a faint smile, his weathered face hardening again, the weight of his decision sinking in. "You don't need to say anything, you just need to live. Don't be like them." Walt turned away, walking slowly toward his porch. But the moment he stepped onto the first step, his legs gave out beneath him. The pain in his body, the toll of the night's events, hit him all at once. His vision blurred, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching at his chest. Thao rushed forward, his voice shaking as he called out for help. But Walt didn't hear him. His world was growing darker, quieter, and he could feel the life leaving his body, a slow and inevitable march toward the end. In the last moments of his life, Walt wasn't afraid. He had given everything he had, his strength, his resolve, his very life, so that others might have a chance to live without fear. He had done what was necessary, even when it cost him everything. It was a price he was willing to pay. And, as the world faded away, Walt Kowalski found the peace he had been searching for, a peace that could only come with sacrifice. The streets were quiet now, almost eerily so. The sirens in the distance grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the broken windows and dirty sidewalks. Thao stood over Walt's body, the young man's face pale and stricken with grief. He had seen so much in his short life, but nothing like this. Nothing that could prepare him for the sight of Walt Kowalski, the man who had become both a mentor and a protector, now lying lifeless in his own driveway. Thao dropped to his knees beside Walt, his hands trembling as he touched the old man's shoulder. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel, some sort of final connection, a last moment of reassurance. But all he felt was the weight of what had just happened. Walt had saved them, all of them, by sacrificing himself in a moment of courage and defiance. And now, Thao was left to carry the burden of that sacrifice. Behind him, the sounds of police cars grew louder. The flash of headlights illuminated the scene, revealing the bodies of the gang members scattered across the street. But there was no time for grief. The reality of the situation was setting in quickly. Thao knew he couldn't stand around, mourning. Walt had never been one to show weakness, and neither could he. He had to act. He had to make sure the sacrifice Walt had made wasn't in vain. As the police began to arrive, Thao stood up and moved toward the back of the house, his steps heavy with the weight of responsibility. He knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for him. Walt's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the start of a new path for the young man who had witnessed it all. The gang that had terrorized their neighborhood was gone, but the scars they left behind would take much longer to heal. The officers quickly took control of the scene, questioning Thao as he explained what had happened. But deep down, he knew there were no words that could fully explain the chaos, the bloodshed, the final stand of an old man who had given everything. Walt had been more than just a neighbor. He had been a man who understood the value of life, the cost of living in a world gone wrong, and the importance of making a stand when it counted. Later that evening, as Thao sat on the porch of Walt's house, staring out at the empty street, he couldn't help but think of the lessons Walt had tried to teach him, the lessons of courage, of honor, and of standing up for what's right. Walt had always been harsh, always been a man of few words, but in the end, his actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. The Gran Torino sat quietly in the driveway, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights. Thao knew the car wasn't just a symbol of Walt's pride. It was a symbol of his fight, his stand against everything that had corrupted the neighborhood. And now, it was a symbol of Thao's future, the future that Walt had fought to secure for him. As he stared at the car, Thao felt a sense of peace wash over him. Walt's fight was over, but Thao's had just begun. He wasn't the same person he had been before. He had witnessed the price of doing the right thing, of making a stand when the world seemed to be falling apart. And now he had a duty, to live up to that legacy, to be better, to be stronger, to make sure that what Walt had fought for didn't die with him. The last ride was over, but the lessons of that night would stay with Thao forever,